This is now the eighth day of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and so far, no slowdown in the assault, especially in the south, where port cities are under continuous shelling. The mayor of Mariupol claimed that hundreds could be dead in his city. The city of Kherson is reportedly under Russian military occupation after several days of rocket attacks. Major cities in the north continue to see large explosions, including the capital of Kyiv and Ukraine's second largest city, Kharkiv. On Wednesday, the UN General Assembly convened an emergency meeting to consider a non binding resolution condemning Russia for its war. It passed with overwhelming support. Only four other countries joined Moscow in rejecting the measure: Belarus, Eritrea, North Korea, and Syria. Even several countries with every reason to be pissed off at the US voted to abstain, and just a sign of how isolated Russia is on this issue. 35 abstentions included Vietnam, Iran, Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia, Nicaragua, and Zimbabwe. Although many of those abstentions also reflected the lack of credibility the U.S. has on the world stage. For example, listen to these comments from the Cuban ambassador to the UN.
Cuba rechaza la hipocresía y el doble rasero. Debe recordarse que Estados Unidos y la OTAN en 1999 lanzaron una agresión de gran envergadura contra Yugoslavia, país europeo que fragmentaron con un alto costo en vidas en función de sus objetivos geopolíticos, desconociendo la Carta de la ONU. Los Estados Unidos y algunos aliados han utilizado la fuerza en múltiples ocasiones. Invadieron estados soberanos para provocar cambios de régimen e intervienen en los asuntos internos de otras naciones que no se pliegan a sus intereses de dominación y que defienden su integridad territorial e independencia. Son también responsables de la muerte de cientos de miles de civiles que denominan daños colaterales, de millones de desplazados y de vasta destrucción en toda la geografía de nuestro planeta como resultado de sus guerras de rapiña.
Well, no lies detected there. On that UN vote, China also abstained, though that will likely only bolster its newfound role as a neutral arbitrator. The Ukrainian foreign minister said that he was hopeful about China overseeing talks because of its ties with Russia. Meanwhile, China's foreign ministry expressed some optimism yesterday, quote, that the two sides will continue the process of dialogue and negotiation. The second round of ceasefire talks is currently underway in Belarus between delegates of the Russian and Ukrainian governments. In addition to the UN vote against Russia, the International Criminal Court said it was opening up a war crimes investigation into the conflict, which could include Russian shelling of civilian areas. The Ukrainian military also appeared to implicate itself in war crimes. Commander of its special forces told the Kyiv Independent that it will not accept the surrender of any Russian artillery troops and that it will kill them instead of taking them prisoner. There are also disturbing reports that continue to come from the Ukraine Poland border, where hundreds of thousands of war refugees are trying to cross. Ukrainian and Polish authorities are discriminating against non white refugees who work and study in Ukraine. African students have reported not being allowed to cross the border and being violently pushed back and beaten. Also, those of Arab and Indian descent have faced similar attacks. Unable to cross the border, they are forced to set up makeshift camps and fires to try to keep warm in the bitter, bitter cold. The UN estimates upwards of 1 million people have now fled Ukraine. Now, there is one positive development since yesterday that's worth mentioning. It looks like leadership in Moscow and Washington have recognized that the talk of nukes was getting a bit too heated. On Wednesday, a spokesperson for the Russian Foreign Ministry clarified that it has no intention of pressing the button, quote, under any pretext or under any condition. Trying to avoid any sort of miscommunication, the Defense Department canceled a nuclear missile test that had been scheduled for today. Pentagon spokesperson John Kirby said the decision was made, quote, to demonstrate we are a responsible nuclear power. It was the only country to ever use the bomb on civilians twice. That's debatable. But at least the test cancellation is a step in the right direction, away from Armageddon. Extraction Capital's favorite senator is seeking more attention. Joe Manchin, who spent the last year sabotaging the most modest investments in climate change and social welfare, told Politico on Wednesday that he wants to strike a deal again. Manchin laid out an outline that he'd support. Be sure it's all bullshit, but worth going over anyway because it reveals just how empty this dude is. It would include revenue raisers that were already agreed to as part of the Build Back Better plan, stuff like tax increases on the wealthy and allowing Medicare to negotiate prescription drug prices. You could get about $1.6 trillion out of that. But Manchin is only willing to put half of that toward new spending, so about $800 billion. That could go toward new climate change investments or maybe one new or expanded social program. Who knows? Manchin was vague because that's not the point in his mind. The point is to reduce the deficit. Yeah, he wants the other $800 billion to go toward deficit reduction. If you're surprised by that, then you forgot that Manchin is a weirdo who forces a staffer to text him every morning with what the national debt currently is. Anyway, this would be a completely meaningless move. Even if you cared about the national debt, which I don't and you shouldn't, but if you did, what good would a one-time payment of $800 billion on a $3 trillion deficit that's contributing to a $30 trillion national debt do? It wouldn't do anything. In like 4 months, it'd be swamped by new debt. It would actually be worse than nothing because it would be money that Joe Manchin diverted from actual useful things like preparing for climate change or paid family leave, diverting it to an incinerator. And I mean that somewhat literally because what's actually driving Manchin's new legislative overtures here is hopes for a big giveaway to the fossil fuel industry. That and the hard-on he has for deficit reduction. Manchin told Politico that he's down for spending on clean energy, but because of the situation right now in Ukraine, he wants oil, gas, and coal production to be a significant part of the energy portfolio. Manchin envisioned the bill to include a ban on oil imports from Russia, which would spur more dirty energy production within the U.S. Manchin himself is heavily invested in coal extraction in West Virginia and thus would personally benefit from any boon to the industry. Again, that's what's really motivating Manchin, not the latest IPCC report or the threat of climate collapse. It's just the profit motive. That's what's behind this shitty compromise proposal, which probably would get even worse once Senator Kyrsten Sinema got her hands on it. She opposes all the revenue raisers that Manchin supports. She's against allowing Medicare to negotiate prescription drug prices. She's one of the top recipients of campaign cash from the pharma industry, and there are currently ads running in Arizona paid for by pharmaceutical lobbyists thanking her for her support and saying they have her back like she has theirs. Sinema, who is also a loyal foot soldier of the Chamber of Commerce, is opposed to raising taxes on the rich. One day it will be really good to just never have to think of these two assholes ever again. Unfortunately, the Democratic Party, which controls Congress and the White House, has ceded all policymaking to these creeps. Hey, thanks for watching. Hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any of our new videos. Also, if you want to see Means Morning News in its complete form, not just the clips we post here, head on over to Means TV and get access to all our new episodes and our entire backlog, plus tons of other great movies and original TV shows.